Happy Star Wars Day, everybody. May the 4th be with you. And if anyone knows me out there, you know I'm a massive Star Wars fan. I don't love them all, but I grew up so much on Star Wars films, and with it being National Star Wars Day, I figured I'd do something I haven't done, which is review all the Star Wars movies. I'll give them all a rating, and by the end of this, I'll give my official ranking. Now, if you've been following me on Twitter, you know I did technically do that about a week and a half ago, but I find it interesting, the legacy of these movies and the way that people's opinions on them have changed over time. And when I review them, I'm actually going to review them based on the order in which they were released. And I understand, to the layman out there, the timeline is a little bit bizarre. You know, continuity is a little bit crazy, but there is a reason why I'm reviewing them in the order of which they were made, because I do believe that the films as a whole have changed regarding how people feel about them over time. But we're going to start with the OG, the original, the 1977 Star Wars A New Hope. It was not called A New Hope when it came out. That was later added. And these first two films are going to be the easiest to talk about because they're perfect. I acknowledge that there's poor dialogue. There's some poor acting, though I do feel like some of this lame dialogue is delivered really well most of the time. But there's a reason why this thing is on TNT every single week, and why people watch it on TV every week, because it's timeless. These characters are timeless. This story is timeless. The worlds that are shown to us are timeless. And one element, because the one issue with doing a video like this is that Star Wars has been so dissected down to the last minute detail so often that it's hard to add something new. But the one thing I will add that I don't think has been talked about enough with these movies, especially the first one, A New Hope, is Alec Guinness as Obi-Wan Kenobi is so good. He got an Academy Award nomination for this. The only actor to ever be nominated for an Academy Award for a Star Wars film, and he adds such a weight to this movie, such an emotional attachment to this movie, and everyone else is a star. Like Harrison Ford, you watch him in this, he's just like the coolest guy ever. The villain in Darth Vader is great. That final battle at the end, I would say my favorite single moment in any movie ever is at the end of this film when Luke is approaching, that kind of pit, that tunnel in the Death Star, and Han Solo comes flying and goes, "Yoo-hoo! Yoo-hoo! You're all clear, kid. Now let's blow this thing and go home." It's like the ultimate moment of cool in any movie. This is a 10 out of 10 for me, and I understand there's flaws, and maybe by certain standards it's dated, but to me, it passes the test 100 times out of 100. It's an important movie. It changed the way that blockbuster films were made, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, is one of the best films ever made. I believe A New Hope is a perfect Star Wars movie, and while I give it a 10 out of 10, I can see somebody watching that and saying, it's got some issues here, some acting issues, some dialogue issues. Empire Strikes Back is a perfect movie. Empire Strikes Back is everything a Star Wars movie should be. Empire Strikes Back is everything that a film should be, everything a sequel should be. It enhances on the groundwork that was laid for the original film. I think it's absolutely fantastic. It's darker, it's deeper, and I'm trying to add things to the discussion that have not previously been added, but one thing about this film and this sequel that I think makes it so much better than the original, outside of it being, darker in tone and having deeper character development, is Darth Vader. In the original film, Darth Vader is obviously very threatening and mysterious. Here, Darth Vader feels invincible in this movie, and you get to that final lightsaber duel in Cloud City, which is so well shot, and Luke, who is fighting so hard, is at a severe disadvantage because he's going up against an unstoppable force. I think A New Hope is the perfect movie to start with if you're recommending that somebody begin the entire Star Wars saga. But if somebody says, you know what, dude, like, I don't want to go down the whole list. Like, give me a Star Wars movie, and if I watch it, I'll get into it. I'd say watch Empire, because Empire is a flawlessly made movie. 10 out of 10. Then we start to see some cracks in the foundation. Return of the Jedi, Episode 6, is a very good movie. It's a better movie than 95% of movies that come out nowadays. And this is where this trilogy is difficult to judge, because as one coherent story, it's perfect. As a 9-hour, 8.5-hour narrative, I can watch all these movies together. In fact, I can't just watch one. If I watch A New Hope, I gotta watch Empire and Return of the Jedi. Like, I have to watch them in order. And I know people have some phenomenal memories with these movies, and I'm going to talk about it with the prequels here. There's some very serious flaws with Return of the Jedi. I know a lot of people jump to the Ewoks and they say, ooh, those Ewoks, those furry little creatures, they ruin the movie. No, I think the Ewoks are a bit of a scapegoat. The issue I have with Return of the Jedi is that I think it's really poorly paced. I think the first 30 minutes of this movie rule, and I think the last 30 to 45 minutes of this movie rule. It does stick the landing. Like, I know there's some people who are like, oh, that ending isn't great. No, the ending is perfect. I think the middle segment is where the film really drags. I complain all the time about how movies are way too long, but A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back are 2+ hour movies that fly by. Those movies are so perfectly paced. You know, it hits all the beats it needs to hit. Here, with Return of the Jedi, you don't really have that luxury. Now, it crosses the finish line with ease, and when I watch these movies, I always have to watch Return of the Jedi, and I smile at the end of it. It's a very emotional end to what is an amazing series. It's a 7 out of 10 for me, because I do get bored, and the other issue that I have is Han Solo kind of sucks in it. Han Solo was so great in the first 2 films, and I know it's famous now among Star Wars fans that Harrison Ford wanted Han Solo to be killed off in Return of the Jedi, and while I'm glad he wasn't, I understand why he wanted that, because I do feel like there's an emotional punch that was kind of lacking in this movie, at least through the first 2/3. They make up for it at the end with the Vader stuff, but I do feel like Han Solo, who is such a deep, interesting character in the first 2 films, kind of gets wasted here, again, until the very end when he hooks up and connects with Leia. But yeah, I do think there's some stuff missing from this movie. It's really solid, but it is vastly inferior to the previous 2 films. Now, this is where things get interesting, and the kiddos out there won't understand this. There was a time where you had to wait for Star Wars. 16 years in between Return of the Jedi and what the film I'm about to talk about, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, when George Lucas said, I want to make prequels. I want to make films that tell the story of how Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader. And one of the earliest memories of my life was sitting on my mom's lap, seeing this movie at a theater in Lansing, Michigan. And I would say, and we've seen some big ones. Avatar, The Dark Knight, Avengers Endgame. I don't think there's ever been a more highly anticipated movie than Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And they've made a whole documentary about how, like, people were in denial about the quality of this movie. And having seen it relatively recently, I can tell you, this movie's not very good. Now, I think this movie suffers from one huge problem. It's really boring. For a movie that was so highly anticipated, for a movie that so many people were looking forward to, it's very flat. And I'm going to talk about it more when I talk about Force Awakens. Force Awakens had a very good energy to it. This movie feels like it's stuck in one gear the whole time. I believe that Star Wars is at its best when it is at its simplest. And having seen this movie so many times, probably around 20 times since it was released in theaters. Some of those times recently, was since I've had, my wits about me. I still don't know what this movie is about. It's something to do with the taxation of trade routes. Now, Star Wars has never really been about this story. Like Empire and A New Hope have somewhat flimsy stories, but you don't care because you really like the characters. Here, there's no genuine protagonist, and this is where it gets tough, because anyone who knows about Red Letter Media knows that they skewered these movies and did these 2-hour reviews that are brilliant and were huge parts of my life when I was in middle school, just the way that they dissected these films. But one of the key pieces of their criticism was the fact that there's no character that you really relate to. Everyone kind of speaks in this flat, monotone dialogue. There's no likable protagonist. It should have been Anakin. It could have been Obi-Wan. Who knows? But it feels so scatterbrained. I don't believe it's the worst movie ever. I watched it with my buddy Anthony Broom. We did commentary tracks for it about a year ago at this time. And on a technical level, I do think it's brilliant. I know people complain, there's too much CG. For 1999, it holds up really darn well, and at least in terms of the visual language of the film, the score. John Williams' Duel of the Fates is just mwah. Oh, Matara. Just amazing. The final lightsaber battle, I think, I will say forever, is the best scene ever in a bad movie. But at the same time, there's nothing to latch on to. There's nothing to really care about. And it's one of the only Star Wars movies, at least of the Skywalker saga, that feels unnecessary. So little of consequence happens in this movie that you don't really feel like you come away believing that this was essential to the Star Wars narrative. And I think it really bogs it down. It's hard for me to turn on it. And when we get to the end of the prequels, I'm going to discuss why it's hard to turn on it. I believe to the layman, it's a 3-4 out of 10. I still give it a 5. I think there's redeeming elements to it. I don't think it's like one of the worst movies ever, but it's a massive disappointment coming off of what was an iconic series with the original 3 films. Next, you have Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. And there are people out there who believe that this is like the worst one. I think a big reason for it is the acting, but more so the writing for the love story between Hayden Christensen and Natalie Portman in this movie does bog the film down. Now, I am a Hayden Christensen defender. Do I think that he's an amazing actor? No, I don't. I think that he's in the Keanu Reeves territory where if you give him good material, he'll thrive. Watch Shattered Glass. It's one of the best movies ever made. The reason I put this well above Phantom Menace is because things of consequence do happen. There's a movement. Like, I think that this is a movie that if you want to fully understand the Star Wars saga, you do need to watch. Now, a lot of that has to do with the third act when the Clone Wars, which they were building up to forever, actually begin. Like, you see that. You see the Battle of Geonosis, and you see all the true shit go down. I do think that it does become essential viewing, and it's annoying because when I reviewed these movies or did a commentary track for these movies with Anthony, I said, like, they should have started the whole trilogy with the Geonosis battle. And I understand what George Lucas was going for, and even when you watch the behind the scenes for Phantom Menace, he makes it very clear. George Lucas wanted to make his Titanic, his epic space opera between two star-crossed lovers. The difference is James Cameron as a writer, and I'm not even saying Titanic is like, the most well-written movie ever, but James Cameron as a writer is leaps and bounds ahead of George Lucas, and Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet as actors are better than Hayden Christensen and Natalie Portman. I don't really blame them for that. I am among the generation of kids who fell in love with Natalie Portman watching this movie, but I think that the reason this whole thing falls apart is because you just don't really buy their romance. There are movies out there that are mediocre that you enjoy simply because the chemistry between the two love interests really works. I do wonder, like, had this movie have been made 10 years later, I feel like it would have starred Ryan Gosling and Emma Stone. Like, these two people who've been in 3 movies together who just have, sparks flying, chemistry everywhere. But I do feel like I'm focusing a little bit too much on that. I like Christopher Lee as Count Dooku. I do wish they would have kept Darth Maul around because I think he was a very unique villain in Episode 1, and I wish they would have given him a little bit more backstory. I think visually the movie looks good. The score, once again, is great. I like Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan. I actually like the little kind of detective story that they have with him. I like the way the movie opens. I remember when I was rewatching these films, like, the first 30 minutes to me make this a better movie than Phantom Menace because you have some stuff that is actually consequential and unique and fits into the Star Wars storyline. I thought it was cool, and I feel like the ending to this movie is pretty darn cool. When you see all the shit go down, finally, it gives you that Star Wars feeling again. I know there's a lot of people who hate this movie, and I think it's a poorly written film. I do give it a mild recommendation, and I think nostalgia is really blinding me there, but it's a 6 out of 10, in my opinion. Next, we move on to Revenge of the Sith. This movie has one big problem, and it's a problem that carried over from the previous 2 films. It's the dialogue. George Lucas is not a good writer. Now, Star Wars A New Hope, which is considered a sci-fi classic, rightfully so, I don't know if that's a very well-written movie. I think, as I said prior, I think the dialogue is delivered well a lot of the time. There are clunky lines of dialogue, but I think all the issues that this movie faces are things that you can't avoid because they were all carryovers from the previous two movies. This is a really good Star Wars movie. Is it a perfect Star Wars movie? No, but man, there is some awesome stuff in this movie. The final act of this film is like, wow. And when it connects back to episode 4, A New Hope, it weirdly redeems itself at the end. You weirdly get to the end of this movie and you're like, wow, this series was actually kind of worth it. Now, I think a big reason for that is because it's the only one of the prequels that feels completely consequential. I talked about this with Clones just a minute ago, where at the end you finally see some stuff that matters. Here, I do actually believe you could probably skip all of Menace and a majority of Clones and not feel like you missed any key elements of the Star Wars saga. Here, if you start with episode 3, you get a lot. I love the opening of this movie. It makes up for a lot of the mistakes of the previous films. Anakin Skywalker is, at least at the beginning, somewhat likable. And when you see his tragic downfall, you believe it. And there's just some really cool scenes. I think the reveal of Darth Vader, and I know people meme the no at the end of it, but the reveal of Darth Vader and just his birth it's so metal, dude. It's so exactly what you would expect it to be. And I think I give a lot of credit to George Lucas, who you can tell really learned from his mistakes of the previous two movies. Lucas found a way to stick the landing. This is a great Star Wars movie, and it has some of my favorite scenes of the entire saga. It's an 8.5 out of 10 for me. It's one of my favorite Star Wars films. I had a very weird life with the prequel films, because obviously when I was a child, 99 through 2005, when these movies came out, I loved them. They were the biggest things in my world when I was in, preschool, kindergarten, third grade, right? And then right around middle school, early high school, the backlash started to come in. And I was under the impression, these movies are bad. And then I went about a decade without watching them. And then when I rewatched them a year ago, I acknowledged every single flaw of these movies and yet couldn't find a way to turn on them. There's nothing wrong with that. We live in this age of cynicism, and trust me, I'm about as cynical a person as there is, especially when it comes to movies, but you're not a bad person for enjoying these films. You're not a bad person for feeling attached to these movies. And I think people try to poo-poo people's nostalgia, and I believe that's entirely wrong. And going to the theater to see them with my cousin and my aunt, dressing up like a little Jedi, going to see these movies, it makes it impossible for you to say, yeah, I don't like these movies, or yeah, these movies are bad. Star Wars is one of those film series that really transcends even the quality of the films themselves. And this is where I'm going to get on my soapbox. These movies mattered to me, and I would grow up and I had all this pent-up anxiousness, but I would wait, because I'm like, man, we're only 4 months away from Star Wars. We're only 3 months away from Star Wars. We're only days away from Star Wars. And I would go to the theater and I would enjoy these movies. I would consume them. And it's what makes childhood innocence such an amazing thing, that I would watch them without the critical lens. I would watch them without the cynicism, and you would enjoy them, and you would take them in, and you wouldn't complain about seeing Yoda hoist a lightsaber for the first time. And that will never go away. That will always be a part of me. So people can crap on these movies all they want, and I acknowledge every single flaw. If somebody said these movies are terrible, they're the worst things ever, well, I might disagree with you. There are a lot of legitimate criticisms that I can't avoid, but they're always in my heart. And it's why if I ever met George Lucas, who was responsible for these first 6 movies, I would give him the biggest hug and just say, thank you. I love Star Wars, but I'm not a fan of what Star Wars has become. Because there used to be a time when you had to wait for Star Wars. When you would stand in line at a theater waiting to get in, and they would swipe your ticket and you're like, wow, I'm walking into a Star Wars movie. Now you can sit down on your couch in your underpants and just watch Star Wars, whether it be a TV series or a cartoon or a movie. I don't like that, Because as a kid who grew up in that era, I believe Star Wars should be something so much more. And that's where we're going to transition to the sequel trilogy. And this is going to surprise some people because the first film we're going to talk about here is a movie I really like. We waited 10 years for Star Wars Episode 7, and I think The Force Awakens is a really darn good movie. I think it is one of the safest films ever made, but I also think if you're doing screenwriting 101, how to reboot a franchise, this movie is close to perfect. Now, it's incredibly derivative. It borrows so heavily from Star Wars A New Hope, but you know what? That never really bothered me. And even J.J. Abrams and Lawrence Kasdan, who wrote the script, made this very clear of like, hey, we want this to feel familiar and derivative. We want to reintroduce people to this world because there was a time in which the prequels were hated, and we're going to reintroduce you back to OG whimsical Star Wars, and I think this movie does it really well. Yes, it's got flaws. When this movie ended, you can't tell me that you weren't at least a little bit intrigued by what the future was going to hold. There's a lot of question marks at the end of this movie that I think a lot of people are excited about going into the next film, and it just gets so much Star Wars nostalgia right. I love the reintroduction of the old cast, and I love the new cast. Kylo Ren, Adam Driver, one of my favorite characters in all of Star Wars, and Daisy Ridley and John Boyega, their chemistry is remarkably charming. And seeing this movie in theaters, it was such a huge deal. It was a massive, massive deal. And that's one complaint that I have, is I think that this is a movie that won't age particularly well because it just works so much better as a movie you see on opening night with a crowd in a packed theater. Now, 7 years later, we exist in an age where packed theaters, aren't really a thing anymore. But when it came out, people loved it. People are soured to it because of what came after. But this is a really good Star Wars movie. It's an 8.5 out of 10. I do like Revenge of the Sith more than this because I do think Revenge of the Sith simply didn't play it as safe. I think Lucas rolled the dice a little bit more with that movie, but here you have J.J. Abrams and Lawrence Kasdan who set up a world that I was so excited to be a part of again, and then we get to the spinoff. It's so weird how the legacy of the post, Disney buyout Star Wars movies have aged, because Force Awakens, when it came out, was genuinely, well received. Again, it was safe, but people said, wow, I can't wait to see the other one. Okay, they're doing this spin-off movie, Rogue One. Rogue One slaps. First of all, this is among the most well-directed Star Wars movies. I believe you had Greg Fraser, who I believe just won an Academy Award for Dune, and he did the cinematography for The Batman, which looks gorgeous. And this movie, it looks and feels different than any other Star Wars movie, and I say that in the best way possible. It is lacking in terms of endearing characters. That is one thing that made the original films so awesome, was that you really related to these characters. This is some of the weakest characterization of any Star Wars movie, and yet I don't care because it has an awesome story. Like a really unique, cool Star Wars story that, quite frankly, in a positive way, retcons one of the biggest jokes that people had made about the Star Wars movies in the past. What was the one thing people always said? Family Guy parodied it about Star Wars A New Hope, which is, why would you build this unstoppable, planet destroying machine and have this one loophole where you can just go down a trench and shoot two proton torpedoes in it and blow the whole thing up? This movie explains that, and I'm sorry, but the last 40 minutes of this movie are absolutely awesome and unlike anything we've seen in any other Star Wars movie. It is a necessary part of Star Wars lore, and while I just kind of criticize the characterization, you get to the end and you do actually feel some semblance of emotion. These characters, as flat as they are at points, do go through a lot throughout this movie, and I think it makes for a very interesting narrative. I think Gareth Edwards deserved to direct more Star Wars movies after this. I would have liked to have seen him direct another spin-off or one of the sequel films, because I think he did a bang-up job with this. And yeah, the one thing I'm leaving out, the best depiction of Darth Vader ever. Better than A New Hope, better than Empire. I know he has a bad pun in this movie, but what you see in this film is the Darth Vader that was always teased but never really shown. He hauls ass through this movie, and that final sequence, which was just a jaw dropper when people saw it in theaters with him, is otherworldly. It's everything you would hope to see out of a Darth Vader sequence. So this is one of my favorites. This is another 8.5 out of 10. And it's really sad because I think everyone at the time was like, wow, Disney is killing it. I remember coming out of this movie and saying, dude, if this is what Star Wars is going to be, Star Wars is about to be the new Marvel. If we're going to get a new Star Wars movie every year, this is going to become something that people don't even understand. People can't even comprehend. This is going to be the biggest film series of all time. And then came The Last Jedi. There are people who believe that Episode 8, The Last Jedi, is one of the worst films ever made. There are people who believe that Episode 8, The Last Jedi, is one of the best Star Wars films of all time. In fact, from a critic's standpoint, this was very well received. I believe it has a 90-something% on Rotten Tomatoes. Where do I fall? I fall somewhere in the middle. I think Luke in this is amazing. And Mark Hamill gives truly a sensational, almost Oscar-worthy performance in this. He's really incredible in this movie. I like the final 20, 30 minutes. The big problem, problems, plural, is one, the movie doesn't really have a story. It's kind of just they get chased. That is the premise. But beyond that, it's the first Star Wars movie that felt mean-spirited. When you watch this film, I think on its own, it's not a terrible movie. But as a sequel to The Force Awakens, it sucks. Like I said earlier, whether or not you liked or loved Force Awakens, or even if you didn't like it at all, that movie set up some really interesting stuff. And this movie goes out of its way to basically say that the people who were excited about the questions that Force Awakens asked are stupid. Oh, wait, you want to see Rey and Finn together? Really? Did you think that they had amazing chemistry? Oh, guess what? You're not going to see him in this movie until the last scene. You want to know who Snoke is? This really mysterious guy played, again, a marvelous motion capture work by Andy Serkis. Oh, you want to know who he is? Guess what? He's nobody, and we're going to kill him off. Oh, you think that Rey is related to somebody who's famous in the Star Wars universe? Well, guess what? She's nobody, which I liked. I liked that and will continue to like that, but they retconned it later, so it doesn't matter. Even the first scene of Luke in this movie, I think, sets the tone for the rest of the film and arguably the rest of the series, which is The Force Awakens ends with this really powerful moment where Rey presents Luke with a lightsaber. And it's wow, you see Mark Hamill again, and you get those chills, and the movie ends. You're wow, this is going to be amazing. The first scene of The Last Jedi, we're going to see Luke take the lightsaber from Rey, and what does he do? He throws it over his shoulder. That's a giant middle finger to your audience. Every person that fell in love with the previous film is now feeling betrayed because you're oh, you like that? Pfft, you're stupid for liking that. But it looks amazing. Kylo Ren is a great character, and his dynamic with Luke is awesome. It's just that it does a poor job of continuing the story from the previous film, and then they fumble the bag again with Rise of Skywalker. And obviously I got to review Solo first, but I'll talk about Rise of Skywalker in a second. I give it a 6.5 out of 10. I don't think it's a bad movie, but I think in terms of continuing the continuity, it's one of the greatest cinematic failures of all time because it isolated its audience to a point where Star Wars fans, who have always been incredibly divided, split down the middle again. And there was no way to win them back after some of the mistakes that this movie made. So The Last Jedi didn't work for a lot of people, but the movie to me, that it didn't ruin my Star Wars fandom. But the moment where I realized, yeah, you know what, Star Wars is just not as important as it used to be was Solo, a Star Wars story. Off the bat, I never bought into the idea of we need to see a Han Solo Star Wars movie. Why? People said, this is going to be the movie in which we see how Han Solo became Han Solo. We saw that movie. It was called A New Hope. It came out in 1977, and it was awesome. Here, the biggest issue with this movie is that it looks like diarrhea. This is one of the ugliest big-budget films I've ever seen. You have Alden Ehrenreich as Han Solo, and he's just not very good. He's not bad, he's just miscast. I saw a lot of names thrown out there. You had Miles Teller, Ansel Elgort. A guy recently, having seen Scream 5 that I think would have been perfect, was Jack Quaid. And you have this guy who, at points, he's trying to do a Harrison Ford impression. At points, he's trying to be, his own character, but he never feels like Han Solo. And I can't get over this. The movie looks awful. The Kessel Run sequence in this, which, again, that's one of those things I do not believe should have ever been shown, but they show it, and I still don't know what it was. It's so dimly lit, so dark, so poorly shot. I had no idea what was going on. This movie is famous for, it had actually 3 directors. You had Phil Lord and Chris Miller, who left the project relatively late into the film's development. You bring in Ron Howard, who ended up doing, reshoots and trying to piecemeal this thing back together. I hate this movie. This is the only Star Wars movie that I hate. I know people hate Phantom Menace. Part of the reason why I can't hate it, like I said, is because of the nostalgia behind it. But I think Phantom Menace has way more redeeming elements to it than this movie does. Nothing about it is memorable. You have the robot character played by Phoebe Waller-Bridge from Fleabag, who is the worst Star Wars character ever. Like, even beyond Jar Jar Binks, she just stinks. Donald Glover is a talented guy, but having watched this movie on TV, at least parts of it on TV recently, he's not that good as Lando. I hate that this discussion needs to be had, but it is true that there is a massive political subtext to the new Star Wars movies that I believe allowed people to turn on it. Lando Calrissian f***s a robot in this movie. Why do we need that? What's the purpose of that? Wokeness and political subtext is not something that should exist in Star Wars, and it's where I actually give Lucas credit because, yeah, the prequels, even the original films, are full of politics, but they don't feel political. They don't feel like there's a message trying to be jammed down our throats. The original Star Wars films, and even the prequels to a certain extent, represent ideal escapist cinema. There's nothing wrong with wanting to just go to a movie and to not be reminded of the current climate. And I think that what The Last Jedi and what Solo failed to do was represent that innocence. There's literally a moment, oh my God, I hate this movie, where they ask the robot character, like, what do you want? And she just goes, equal rights. First of all, not funny. Like, if it was funny, I'd be like, it's whatever, I'll give it a pass. But you're just trying to jam in some sort of pseudo-political messaging that doesn't fit and should never fit in Star Wars. And I know there's people out there who say, like, if you can't accept political messaging, like, well, then you just can't, like, live in the real world, bro. No, you can. When we're talking about fucking Star Wars, yes, it matters. Sorry. Hey, everyone. So this video was recorded several days ago, and I was watching it back after producer Matt had put all the fixings out on it, did a wonderful job once again, and I wanted to come back on here and more calmly explain the point I'm trying to make about Solo, a Star Wars story, and really about all the Disney Star Wars movies in general. I am somebody who's all for inclusion and diversity, and I have no problem with discussing hot-button political issues. I think that it's very important. You shouldn't just bury your head in the sand. And I have no issue with those issues being discussed on film. I'm saying that I think that Star Wars is an improper place to do that. If you want to have a character in your movie who's gay, great. No problem at all. If you want to have minority characters in your movie, great. No problem at all. But they have to feel organic within the context of the story that you are creating. And so much of what is shoved into these Disney Star Wars movies, especially post-Rogue One, feels very forced. I loved Lando Calrissian in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and yet there wasn't a single moment where I'm like, oh, well, this is clearly a guy who likes to hook up with robots. It feels forced. When Force Awakens came out, nobody brought up the fact, hey, there's a black stormtrooper. Finn was just a character. John Boyega was just an actor playing a role. Didn't bother anybody. And then Last Jedi came out, and it's where I'm still very mad at Rian Johnson for doing this. He introduced a character named Rose, played by Kelly Marie Tran, a very talented actress who I felt like in that movie did not give a very good performance, and the fans did not like the character. Now, of course, you heard the stories about how she was bullied online, and I'm sure there was a bunch of racist idiots there as well, and I completely disavow any of that behavior, but for the most part, Star Wars fans complained about her because they didn't like the performance and they didn't like the character. And when they asked Rian Johnson about it, he said, and this was his quote, these are his words, not mine, if people want to complain about diversity, f*** them. We're not complaining about diversity, we're complaining about the character. They are not one and the same. Writing a minority character and then saying, well, you just didn't like them because they're a minority, that's lunacy. And I think that, sadly, Disney has opened Pandora's box here, and it's led to a very toxic subculture of people who are using Star Wars now to make political and social talking points. And in my opinion, that completely goes against the purity of George Lucas's original vision. So while I have no issue with diversity or LGBTQ representation, I think I got all that right, the way it's woven into the new Star Wars movies feels really lame, very forced, and very shoehorned into the story. And it's most notable, in my opinion, in Solo, a Star Wars movie. It doesn't make these movies bad, but it is a flaw with pretty much all of them. You're not wrong for not wanting to go to a Star Wars movie and see political messaging. And so this is a 3 out of 10. I hate this movie. Then we get to the final film of the Skywalker saga, Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. I feel bad for this movie. I think it's a bad film, but I do believe that the damage that The Last Jedi did, whether you like it or not, the isolation that so many fans felt coming out of The Last Jedi was something that JJ felt a need to retcon with Episode 9, and what you end up with is a single movie that feels like 2 movies in one. This is one of those instances in which I do believe it would have been smarter if they would have split this final part of the saga up into 2 films, because this movie constantly feels like it's just sprinting, like trying to get away from something. You're trying to separate yourself from The Last Jedi, but you're also trying to finalize, put a bow end on this entire 9 film arc, and it just simply does not work. It feels like a bad piece of fan fiction. And I just remember seeing this movie in the theaters. And 4 years prior, I sat in the theater and watched Force Awakens and just remembered seeing the crowd and seeing the audience just so excited to see it. And when we came into Rise of Skywalker, people felt very blasé. They felt very kind of, like the energy in the theater was just not there. And I spoke about it when this movie came out. Whether you like, Last Jedi or not, the movie did divide people a lot. And this movie does all it can to try to win those people back, but you can't do that. This feels like a Frankenstein's monster of a movie in the worst way possible. And because of that, I can't give it like a fully negative review. I like what they do with Kylo Ren, but bringing back the Emperor, what are you doing? Like, come on. Like I said, what is this, fan fiction? There was no need for that. You had a story. You set up a really coherent story with Force Awakens, and it's sad what happened to these last 2 movies. I give this a 5 out of 10. It's the Star Wars movie that I have the hardest time talking about because its problems, there's just so much on its sleeve, as are its strengths. Like, there's not a whole lot to dissect here. It's just a bloated mess of a film, and it's why there are people out there nowadays who believe that the prequels are better movies than the sequel trilogy. I think, objectively speaking, on a filmmaking level, the sequels, episode 7, 8, and 9, are better movies than the prequels. They feature better acting, better writing, better character development, but the prequels are better Star Wars movies. Because what Star Wars is, it's this long, winding narrative that tells these Shakespearean story arcs that borrow from, famous film serials of the 30s and 40s, and the prequels had a coherent vision to them. Yes, they're messy, and Lucas made some changes along the way. I highly doubt, after he wrote the script for episode 1, that Jar Jar Binks was going to be essentially taken out of the trilogy by the 3rd film, but he made some adjustments, and those movies got better as they went along. And when you got to the end of Revenge of the Sith, you went, I get what he was going for here, and it doesn't work entirely. In fact, a lot of it doesn't work, but it is one guy's vision, and it's why I do appreciate those movies for what they are, because we exist in this age of big budget studio filmmaking and world building and universe connecting and You had some guy who essentially made three $200 million movies in the sandbox. The sequels, I believe, are probably better movies that feature better actors and better characterization, but nothing feels cohesive. Nothing feels like it connects. Instead of making one trilogy, you made 3 separate films, and it divided a lot of people. And it's where I get heartbroken about what Star Wars has become. Now, I disagree with people who say, Disney ruined Star Wars. Guys, like, come on. Watch Phantom Menace. Watch the holiday special. Like, Star Wars has been beaten into the ground for a long time. I don't agree with the idea that, like, Star Wars was this infallible, perfect thing until Disney came along. But I do believe that there is something to be said about the pureness of George Lucas's vision that has since become a massive corporate conglomerate run by Mickey Mouse. It's the most bizarre saga that's ever been made, but I think it's so important for film and film criticism. Even the worst of these movies. Solo is just a piece of crap that, like, should have been, disposed of before it even got made. But all these other movies, I think it's very interesting that you can have a saga, that you can have a series of films where truly, I believe of the 11 films that have existed, mainstream releases that have existed in the Star Wars universe, I think probably only 4 or 5 of them are, like, really good. But I think it's very interesting that you have this series where the quality varies so much, and yet you can discuss them ad nauseum 20 years later. Like, I gave Phantom Menace a 5 out of 10. By all accounts, a 5 out of 10 movie should be a movie that you forget 2 weeks after its release. But personally, I find them fascinating. I'm telling you right now, 10 years from now, there's going to be a generation of people who were children when Force Awakens came out who are going to claim that the sequel trilogy was amazing. And that's okay. I think that the reason why these movies have had this long-lasting legacy is that they are films you show to your kids. And they are films that those children carry over to their children. There's an innocence to that doesn't exist really with any other saga. I know people try to say the MCU is the modern-day Star Wars. The Batman films are the modern-day Star Wars. No. There is something about Star Wars that simply hits differently than every other film series. This will be the longest video I've ever made, but I'm glad I made it. For people wondering, my official ranking of all the Star Wars movies, and I posted this tweet about a week ago. At the bottom, number 11, Solo, A Star Wars Story. I think it's the worst Star Wars movie ever made. I don't even really consider it a Star Wars movie. Number 10, The Rise of Skywalker. Not good at all. Tries to make up for a lot of the mistakes of The Last Jedi. It's not an awful movie, but I don't like it. Number 9, The Phantom Menace. Fascinating in its badness. A few redeeming elements, but not good at all. Number 8, Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Very similar, but I do think the final act of that movie is very consequential. Number 7, Star Wars The Last Jedi. Very divisive, but has a lot of really spectacular stuff in it, and it's very well shot. Number 6, Return of the Jedi. Number 5, The Force Awakens. Number 4, Rogue One. Number 3, Revenge of the Sith. Number 2, A New Hope. And number 1, The Empire Strikes Back. All right, wow. I feel like I just let out like this huge release. These are movies I've talked about before, but this is the most in-depth I've ever talked about them, and I'm glad I did. This is a very fun video to make, so thank you very much for watching, everybody. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Let's get those watch hours up. Peace and happiness, and may the Force be with you.